Rose did not realize she had a problem until she found herself looking forward to paperwork. Under normal circumstances, paperwork represented everything wrong with civilized society. It was slow, repetitive, frequently pointless, and somehow capable of creating additional paperwork whenever someone attempted to reduce it. Rose had watched entire departments generate mountains of reports whose sole purpose appeared to be explaining why previous reports existed. The fact that Dr. Voltra spent so much time fighting paperwork had become one of the more understandable aspects of her personality. Yet when Voltra informed her that they would be spending the day handling administrative errands throughout the city, Rose found herself strangely pleased by the idea. The realization bothered her immediately, because it wasn't the work she was looking forward to. The city surrounding the hospital district had become familiar over the past several months, though Rose still occasionally caught herself staring upward at the towering structures that dominated the skyline. Cargo traffic drifted between elevated transit routes. Massive corporate offices stood beside residential complexes large enough to house entire farming communities. Thousands of people moved through the streets below in organized chaos. Normally, Rose found the city interesting. Today, she spent most of her attention elsewhere. She walked beside Voltra, carrying several reports while the doctor reviewed a schedule projected above a tablet. The sight itself had become routine. That fact bothered Rose almost as much as the reason she had been looking forward to the trip in the first place. Voltra moved through the city exactly the way she moved through the hospital. She never appeared uncertain. She never hesitated. Even when she was completely wrong, she somehow carried herself with enough confidence that reality often seemed willing to reconsider its position. Merchants recognized her. Employees greeted her. Several pedestrians altered course the moment they spotted her approaching. Voltra either failed to notice or considered the reaction completely reasonable. Rose strongly suspected it was the second one. The doctor navigated crowded streets with the same certainty she brought to surgery, administration, and arguments. Since arguments represented one of her favorite hobbies, this inevitably resulted in several before midday. The first supplier meeting ended when Voltra discovered that a shipment had been delayed due to a clerical error. The second ended when she learned that somebody had attempted to solve a staffing shortage by altering several reporting requirements. The third somehow became an extended discussion regarding procurement regulations and whether basic literacy should be considered mandatory for management positions. Rose contributed almost nothing to any of these conversations, yet found herself enjoying them anyway. Watching Voltra dismantle flawed reasoning had become strangely entertaining. The doctor never raised her voice. She never needed to. Instead, she simply continued asking questions until the problem collapsed beneath its own weight. That realization unsettled Rose more than she cared to admit. She should not have found any of this entertaining. None of these conversations involved her. None of them affected her life in any meaningful way. Yet she found herself anticipating Voltra's responses before they happened. She knew when the doctor's ears would flatten. She knew when her tail would begin to twitch. She knew the expression Voltra wore whenever somebody presented a problem that could have been prevented through basic competence. Somewhere along the way, Rose had learned these things without realizing she was learning them. Around midday, Voltra abruptly abandoned a discussion regarding contract approvals and announced that she was hungry. Rose expected them to return to the hospital. Instead, Voltra led her several blocks away and into a small restaurant built into the lower levels of a commercial tower. The owner greeted the doctor by name before immediately accusing her of refusing to try a new menu item. Voltra responded by accusing him of replacing a perfectly acceptable menu with a worse version of itself. Neither sounded angry. Neither sounded offended. The argument simply appeared to be how they communicated. Rose spent several minutes watching the exchange unfold while trying to understand why it fascinated her so much. At the hospital, most people treated Voltra like an approaching storm. They respected her, feared her, avoided her, or endured her. Here, the owner simply disagreed with her. Not cautiously, not professionally, casually. The two continued arguing while food arrived. They continued arguing while they ate. They continued arguing after the owner returned to the kitchen. Somehow, the entire conversation remained friendly despite the fact that neither participant seemed interested in agreeing about anything. The experience lingered in Rose's thoughts long after they left. It wasn't really the argument itself that interested her. It was the reminder that Voltra existed outside the role Rose had originally placed her in. She wasn't simply a doctor. She wasn't simply an owner. She wasn't even simply the most important person in Rose's daily life. She had favorite restaurants, familiar routes through the city, Ongoing disagreements with local business owners, friends, rivals, history. The realization should not have felt significant, yet somehow it did. Rose had spent months learning how Voltra fit into her life without ever considering that Voltra had a life of her own. The remainder of the afternoon passed in much the same way. Meetings were attended, reports were reviewed, contracts were signed. Somewhere between one office and the next, Rose caught herself laughing at a complaint Voltra made regarding administrative policy. The reaction escaped before she could stop it. Voltra glanced toward her with obvious satisfaction before continuing the conversation. The expression lasted less than a second. Rose still noticed it. Unfortunately, she was beginning to notice far too many things. That fact became impossible to ignore during the walk back toward the hospital district. Evening lights illuminated the city while cargo transports moved overhead and workers filtered toward residential sectors. The crowds had thinned enough that conversation would have been easy. Neither woman felt any need for it. Voltra reviewed documents while walking. Rose carried the completed contracts. The silence between them settled naturally into place, and Rose suddenly realized she liked it. Not because it was comfortable, not because it was familiar, because it was theirs. The thought struck with enough force that she nearly stumbled. Rose stared straight ahead while her mind attempted to recover. One realization connected itself to another with alarming speed. She liked spending time with Voltra. She looked forward to seeing her in the morning. She enjoyed hearing her complain about things. She cared about her opinions. She paid attention when she entered a room. She remembered details that had absolutely no reason to remain in memory. The individual observations had existed for weeks. Seeing them together transformed them into something much harder to ignore. Voltra glanced up from her tablet and immediately noticed the change in expression.
You look concerned.
Rose nearly dropped the contracts. The reaction happened quickly enough that she couldn't prevent it, which only made the situation worse. Voltra stared at her for several seconds before lowering the tablet.
Are you ill?
The question carried genuine concern that somehow made everything significantly more difficult. Rose forced herself to answer normally. She explained that she had simply been thinking. Voltra accepted the explanation immediately and informed her that thinking was a dangerous hobby before returning to the documents. The comment was absurd. Rose laughed anyway. Voltra looked pleased by the reaction. Not proud, not smug, simply pleased. Once again, the expression vanished almost immediately, but Rose had already seen it. The evening routine proceeded normally after that. Dinner became paperwork. Paperwork became reports. Reports became preparation for the following day. Nothing unusual happened. Nothing dramatic occurred. Yet throughout the entire evening, Rose remained painfully aware of the realization she had carried home from the city. By the time she finally returned to her room, the conclusion had become impossible to avoid. Rose liked Dr. Voltra, not as an owner, not as an employer, not as the person responsible for her life. She liked Voltra herself. Rose sat quietly on the edge of her bed for a long time afterward. The room was silent. The city lights shone through the window. Somewhere else in the house, Voltra was probably still working. The thought arrived uninvited. Rose immediately wished it hadn't. Unfortunately, wishing accomplished nothing. Once acknowledged, the feeling refused to disappear. The worst part was that she already knew what she intended to do about it. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Voltra was her owner. Rose was her slave. The situation was complicated enough without introducing impossible fantasies into it. Whatever feelings had begun developing would remain private. They would remain contained. They would remain hers alone. The decision felt sensible, responsible, and completely doomed.